Why most United States of America states? Why most United States of America states? I don't know about that. Why most states in the United States of America is going broke? There's over 27 states that's operating at a deficit. Most of them are liberal, and a lot of them are on the pathway to bankruptcy if they don't do something differently. Let's talk about it. Make sure y'all hit a like for the algorithm, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications. Let's get into it.
State governments in the U.S. are running out of cash.
After meeting our obligations, we have very little money left.
One count suggests that 27 states lack the necessary funds to pay their bills. The problem is most prominent in states like Connecticut, New Jersey, and Illinois.
Not only City of Chicago, but State of Illinois is running straight into a brick wall in terms of its finances. City of Chicago is facing $1 billion deficit. The state's facing a massive deficit while also needing to bail out things like the Chicago Transit Authority. Chicago Public Schools is asking for a bailout. The state cannot afford these things.
States received about $800 billion from the federal government to kick off the decade. That spending obscured long-running issues.
What we're seeing is largely a return to earth from those pandemic surpluses.
We saw a big increase in income taxes. There was really like a bit of an economic boom.
States now are working with tighter budgets as the country's population and infrastructure ages. Even economically powerful states see trouble ahead.
To the degree that the states are relying on federal aid, it becomes a daisy chain of vulnerability.
State governments account for 15% of the nation's economic output, and they employ 13% of the U.S. workforce. So why
is states employing the majority of the workforce? That is so dumb to me. But anyways.
Are so many state governments going broke? And what can they do to repair their finances? State governments pay for much of the nation's systems of education, healthcare, transportation, and public housing. But
actually, it's not state governments, it's taxpayers, but we'll get there. I'm going to break it down for y'all from a C student's perspective.
They receive tremendous amounts of help from the federal government to do that. In 2022, federal grants covered 38% of total spending from state governments. That was a bit more than usual.
During the pandemic, we saw a lot of one.
So, essentially what they're describing to you guys is that the states then became reliant. It's just like any infusion of money, right? It may be temporary. It may be proposed to be temporary, but the states then become dependent on it in order for them to balance their budgets, similar to the cities, right? And so what they do is they get these federal grants because they basically did more borrowing, printing more money, running up inflation and a deficit. And so they then, in the name of the pandemic, started to distribute more funds, and that's how they hired more teachers, and they kept them on a payroll. And so instead of these states actually learning how to manage their budget more effectively and only budgeting for and planning for, even when you get this infusion, even when you get these couple of years of good years, because the federal government is going to subsidize you through the taxpayers, which then raises the cost of living for most of us, and it also puts us at a deficit as far as them having to raise more tax money and more tax dollars, which you then get Bernie Sanders and AOC and Kamala Harris and Biden saying, hey, more rich people need to pay their fair share. No, you got drunk off of COVID money. And so what they did was they knew that it wasn't sustainable, but instead of us having responsible legislators on a state level in most of these places and a city saying, you know what, we can't bake this into our yearly budget. We can't make this a part of our yearly budget. This is an infusion, but this is not something that we actually depend on. It's just like you. Budgets are very much the same. They just get bigger and they get more irresponsibly used depending on what government agency is using it. And it's just like your own regular budget. It's just like you and your regular budget. What happens is you become more dependent on money that you know you can't sustain on. You go and buy cars. You go and do all of this other stuff. You can come in. You go and buy cars, you go and do all of this other stuff, and you know that you can't actually manage a car note on it. You can't maintain your lifestyle. Me personally, I generate a lot of income, but at the same time, I use the majority of it to invest, and the actual cost of maintaining my lifestyle is very, very low. So even if you're going through the ebbs and flows, even if you have a company that then goes through a lull or it may not be as profitable or you make a lifestyle change, You're largely unaffected because you were never dependent on that money in the first place. That was just a boost. In that boost, you then use it to pay off debt or invest in another company or generate more revenue by investing in this or increasing your business. You don't become dependent on the money, and that's why we have to be more fiscally responsible and why we also have to elect leaders that understand how to manage budgets more effectively. Let's continue.
One-time revenue, a lot of one-time expenditures that kind of had the effect of obscuring these long-term challenges that states faced.
The ensuing economic boom strengthened state coffers and increased revenues. The increase in revenue helped state leaders lower taxes and increase spending.
We, you, all of us together, delivered both the largest tax cut ever by a huge margin and the largest increase in teacher salaries in our state's history.
We understand that that's, something that is politically palatable, particularly in the time of an election.
So they use that to market it to you guys to get them to vote for them, but they can't sustain it. And so it then becomes a moot point because they're robbing Peter to pay Paul. They can't sustain it. And this is why we need to become more informed as voters and also participate on a local level because these people are finessing y'all. That's just the facts.
It is something that if those receipts decline, we may see some future imbalances between, expenditures and revenues that states will have to correct.
Virtually every state made a tax cut. In some cases, this is a very intentional plan for states to spend down these unexpectedly high revenues. On the other side, this could really reflect tightening budget conditions and states needing to draw on those dollars to help make ends meet right now.
But the federal funds given to states will run out in 2026 as a cost of living crisis hits many parts of the country.
For too many, the cost of living is too high.
The higher cost of living is making some state leaders consider tax relief. That includes places like Wyoming and North Dakota.
States that do well are North Dakota, Idaho, South Dakota. And what these states really have in common is that they have a relatively limited fiscal footprint.
Many policymakers across the states, they did pretty well managing the pandemic era budget surpluses. A huge looming question out there is around the long-term affordability of the tax cuts and spending increases that were enacted.
State governments also have to manage long-running financial liabilities.
There are states like Illinois, Connecticut, and New Jersey. While these states really have accumulated a lot of debt after the great financial crisis, the main reason for their weak fiscal stance is the pension obligation.
Roughly 86% of public employees receive pensions. These are retirement plans that provide guaranteed income for life.
State and cities, in order to attract public servants, maybe paying them less money than they would make in the private sector, provide generous pensions. And they ended up getting behind.
Do you guys know how they incentivize people to work for the federal government instead of going into the private sector? It's three ways. It's three main pitches. Number one, they pitch it to you based off of stability. So you're less likely to get laid off if you actually work for the public sector instead of working for the private sector, because they can always go to the well and get more money from the federal government, or they can just tax taxpayers more, okay? Number two, they incentivize you by the benefits because you usually don't make as much money if you are inside of the private sector, and you're much more likely to have some tumultuous life changes because the private sector will adjust according to whatever their budgets is or whatever it is that they bring in revenue, right? If you work for a great company, you'll probably do well. If you don't work for a great company or your company go through something, it's a possibility you can get laid off. And so they also incentivize you by saying that, hey, job stability and the benefits. We'll double match this. We'll give you a pension, all of that stuff. Well, guess what? At some point, they're going to have to manage that so that they'll always be able to pour into that pension while you're still alive and while your spouse is still alive, because they promised you that benefit. They promised you this healthcare coverage for the rest of your life. They promised you this pension. They promised you to be able to double match your contribution into your 403B. And so that's another way that they get you to then buy in. And then the last way that they get you to buy in is they say, hey, if you work for the public sector or for a nonprofit or for a government agency for the next 10 years, we'll put you on an income-based repayment plan for your student loans, and we'll forgive your student loans. Those are the ways that they recruit you. But guess what? Somebody has to come in and manage that budget effectively, even when the governor goes out and the new one comes in, the mayor goes out and the new one comes in, aldermen and city council people goes out, new people come in. They're going to have to manage that. That guy Quincy says, no lie, Anton, I had the best benefits ever when I worked for the state. Exactly, right? They give you great benefits. I worked for the University of Michigan. They double matched my 401k. They didn't pay me a lot of money, but I got the experience. They also made sure that they took care of me and made sure that they paid for my continuing my education. So they paid for any classes once I transferred over from a community college into a major university. And so I was able to still forego having to pay any money so that I would then wouldn't have to pay my own money for major universities or take out student loans. And so there's ways and there's reasons to leverage that, right? And so you get great benefits, you get great healthcare coverage and all of that stuff. You just may not make nowhere near as much money as you do in the private sector. So you got to balance that out. But again, they have to manage those pensions. They have to manage that budget. They have to manage those benefits. They have to manage all of that, right? And so that then comes with the benefits of working in a public organization or in the public sector or for a government agency versus working in the private sector. That's why I have so much criticism for Kamala Harris and these lifetime politicians that then craft these policies on experiences that they've never had. You've never worked in the private sector before. You don't really know what business owners, you've never started a business before. And so you don't know anything about this. The only thing you know is about being a lifetime politician. You got a guaranteed salary, a guaranteed benefits package, and a guaranteed budget, and you're going to get rich from it. And we already know how they get rich from it. Let's continue.
If pension liabilities are fully accounted for, as many as 27
Somebody
states
says
lack
I'd
the
rather
money
make
needed
more
to
money.
pay
It
their
depends on your
bills.
circumstances
What
and it depends
goes
on how you
a
manage
little
it.
bit under the radar is that pension liabilities are an extremely expensive form of debt. The portion of the pension that is unfunded increases by 7% every single year.
This debt leaves states with less money to fund public programs.
So we're talking hospitals, we're talking about roads, we're talking about schools.
Take Illinois, for example, which owes money to former employees, but has less than half of the funds raised to pay them back.
And that ain't even talking about the city. That's the state of Illinois.
And
They have a population. You know what? It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense as to why they're so adamant about getting more migrants on the tax rolls. And migrants for Illinois and Chicago is like an investment. It's a longer-term play and a longer-term investment. They want them to buy homes there. They want them to go to the schools there. They want them to be open businesses there. Ultimately, they're hoping, not guaranteeing, but they're hoping that migrants become a part of the fabric of Chicago because so many people are leaving because they've mismanaged the state and the city so horribly. They're hoping for them to become a part of the fabric of the system. It kind of reminds you of Minneapolis, where Tim Walz is from. I don't know anybody that says, man, I can't wait to move to Minneapolis. They don't do that. They don't move to the Twin Cities. Okay? So what happens is they've replaced the people that then leave with a Somali population that then is basically taking over Minneapolis, that's taking over Minnesota, and they're so ingrained in the fabric of the system, they become a new base for them, which then everybody that's a part of those government branches have to then petition them for their vote and meet their expectation because now they maintain in power. Because everybody wanted to move out. Everybody wanted to move to Florida. Everybody wanted to move to Texas. Everybody wanted to move to all of these places. I'm telling you that they're investing into a population that ultimately they're hoping to become a part of their taxpayer base and their voter rolls and also paying the property taxes by giving them a leg up inside of their communities. They're playing a long game instead of pouring into the people that's already there. And so many people are leaving these places because they can't afford to, nor do they want to subject themselves to the crime and the statistics and the problems that's going on inside of these states and these communities at all.
Analysis from JP Morgan that says in order to actually fund these enormously generous promises that were made decades ago, you would have to double the state income tax overnight in Illinois.
Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has steadily kept spending on areas like roads, in addition to education.
Penny by penny, we are still working together saving important things for our state.
This requires tax increases to balance the budget. But that option may not be available to a state like Illinois, which already has relatively high tax rates.
Using taxes
Look at the places that got the highest tax rates. Look at this. New York. Highest tax states. New York, Connecticut, Hawaii. I thought about going to visit Hawaii for the winter. Maybe I'll do it next year. I don't want to do it this year because I just want to stay home. I just want to stay home and work on my studio. Vermont, California, New Jersey, Illinois, Virginia, Maine, and Delaware. Top 10 high tax states.
Relatively high tax rates.
Using taxes to raise additional revenue is limited.
Higher taxes tend to make people move, especially top earners. That's according to studies on states like California.
When the marginal tax rate increases by 3%, California loses about 0.8% in the tax base in the top income bracket. That's actually substantial because it's like 1% of the tax base in the very high bracket, which for the most part accounts for the majority of tax revenues overall.
Moving forward, state governments must respond to emerging risks like more extreme weather, an aging population, and migration.
Migration, I believe, is going to be one of the biggest issues that will face the country.
So now all of the states is also in competition with each other to get more people to move to their state so they can increase their voter rolls. Ultimately, it's going to be a lot of states that suffer if they don't start to course correct, and if these migrants and actually these investments in people don't start paying off, it's going to be havoc. It's going to be hell to pay. I think that Oakland and Chicago is going to be the next major cities that suffer.